This is section 1.2 continued, and this is the third video and last video in this section. We are still talking about the basics of functions and their graphs, and this video should be all reviewed from your Algebra 2 class because it's just identifying domain and range from a graph. Notice this is a target 1.3 for our class. Now, getting started, the only difference between this and Algebra 2 is going to be the notation we use, and we're going to use a little bit more of a formal notation that you'll see used in your book. Now, that doesn't mean that the inequality notation that you used in Algebra 2 is incorrect. You can still use that notation, but you also need to know this notation so that you know what the book is asking. It'll often show up also on standardized tests, and it'll be the way they word questions. Now, the basic thing about this notation is that you need to know the difference between two different things. The first one would be a bracket, and the second one would be a parentheses. Now, if we're using a bracket, that means we're going to include the point. So a bracket is going to mean include. And a parentheses then would mean to not include. And that's really the only thing that you'll need to know in this notation, and it becomes very simple. So, domain and range, a quick review, domain will be your possible x values, range will be the possible y values on the graph. So looking at this first example, we'll start with the domain, and I like to sometimes just put it onto the x-axis so I can look at my x values. You'll notice an open circle here at -1, so that means we're not including that point. Someone punched a hole out there. And then finally it goes all the way here on the x's until +4 and it's closed, so then that would be including that point. Now, just a quick reminder, the way that you probably wrote this in Algebra 2 is that you would say -1 and then you would use the less than sign because we're not including x, which then would be less than or equal to 4. Now this is not incorrect, you can still write it this way. But the way that I'll show you is a lot quicker because now all we have to do is say we're not including -1, so we're going to use a parentheses. And then we'll set -1, and we're going to go a comma, meaning all the way to +4, and we're including +4, so we'll use a bracket. And so that is the way in this class I'm going to be writing the domain. And you'll notice it's a lot shorter. Just remember you go smallest number first, biggest number last, just the way you would with your inequality. Now, the same example, if we want to look at the range, we're going to look at the y values. So let's go ahead and squish this instead of the x-axis. Now we'll put it on the y-axis and see what's happening, because range, again, is possible y values. So it looks like our smallest y value here is +1, and we're including that. Our biggest y value is 3, and we're not including, and we have everything in between. If we were to write this the way you did in Algebra 2 with inequalities, we'd say +1 less than or equal, because we're including y, which is less than +3. But now, using the shortcut with our parentheses and our brackets, we'll use a bracket for the +1 because we're including. We're going all the way to 3, and I'll use a parentheses there for not including. And so there's your domain, and then there's your range. At this point now, I'm just going to continue using parentheses and brackets. I won't be writing the answers in inequalities, but again, you can always write them that way if you prefer. It's the same thing. So moving on to the next example. The next example here is a little bit different because it looks like we have an arrow, so we're going to have something with infinity here. We're going to go on forever. So just taking a look first at the domain. For our domain, our possible x's, it looks to me like the smallest is 3, and we're including, and then it's going to go on forever and ever and ever. So we're going to use a bracket for the 3, comma, and then we'll say to +infinity. Now here's the question. Does infinity get a bracket or a parentheses? Can you ever be infinity? Can you ever get to infinity? I hope you're answering no. You can never reach infinity. Since you can never reach infinity, infinity is always going to get a parentheses. So that infinity or negative infinity will always get a parentheses, always. Because you can never be infinity. Now for the range, our possible y values, it looks like we're starting at 0, and this graph is slowly increasing forever and ever and ever, so we'll be going up forever. So our range would be 0, including 0 to infinity. with a bracket or parentheses. All right, why don't you pause your video and give this one a try and see how you do, and then you can check your answer. Hopefully you decided for the range that we are going from negative infinity to 3. Now if you wrote it backwards, 3 to negative infinity, you want to make sure you start with the smallest number first. And again, the negative infinity got a parentheses, not a bracket. And the range was from positive 0 to positive infinity. Here's the next one. Let's work out this one together. So, starting with the domain, now notice that we got a little point in the graph here and some open circles, so we'll see what happens. Starting with our domain, it looks like our smallest x value is negative 4, and we're going all the way to positive 3, and every point in between there is touched. So in this case, in fact, we will say negative 4 to positive 3 for our domain. And we're going to include the negative 4, so we'll use a bracket, but we're not including positive 3, so we'll use a parentheses. The range here is maybe a little bit different. The reason is that the endpoints aren't necessarily the lowest point on the graph, this one endpoint. The highest point on the graph is here at positive 2. But the lowest point, it looks like, is way down here and touches negative 2, and in fact it does touch there, so it will be a closed circle. Now what about at this 0? Over here we have an open circle, but over here we touch there, so if we put them together it would end up crossing there, so it looks like we have everything in between. So our range, we're going to include everything from negative 2 to positive 2. Notice that the endpoints aren't necessarily the numbers that go first and second. Continuing with some more examples. No, I'm sorry, that's our last example for the day. You're going to go ahead now and answer this multiple choice question in your Google form. You're finding the domain and range, so do your multiple choice and answer there. And then here's your free response question as well for your Google form.